I'm recording my homily for the second Sunday of Lent. And I'm going to build a little bit off of what I was talking about last week with the three temptations, right? So you had the three temptations. Jesus is out in the desert and he's being tempted. The first temptation was kind of this temptation to get Jesus off track just enough so he's fighting the wrong battle, right? So, or in some ways I guess you could say so that he doesn't feel like he needs to fight that battle. So he was out in the desert fasting and Satan's like, just really this compassionate guy. It's like, Jesus, you don't need to do that, right? You don't need to fast. You don't need to worry about that, right? Well, he takes it to the next level in the second temptation, which is where I want to go today. So the second temptation, he takes him up to a high place. Now it doesn't say a mountain, but let's imagine it being a mountain, right? Because I'm gonna have us journey through a couple mountains in salvation history. So if you ever go to the Holy Land, you can go to the Mount of Temptation, which is, at least by tradition, the place where Jesus was tempted. Now, if you ever go there, it's interesting because you have to take a tram, right? So you take a tram all the way up, and then from the tram, you walk up this dirt path up to this big steel door. And the steel door is where you have to enter if you want to go up to the exact spot of the temptation. Now, there's an Orthodox monastery that's basically built right there, which is kind of an interesting place to put a monastery, place of temptation. But anyways, so when we were there, we were taking the tram up. Well, there was this young married couple that joined us on the tram, right? So our group was going up and this young married couple that wasn't with us joined us. And so we were talking to them a little bit, just being friendly. So you walk up, you get to the steel door where there's a group in front of us. So we weren't the first group, there was a group in front of us. So they knock on the steel door and a monk comes and answers it. And the question he asks them is, are you a church group? Now the group that was in front of us, they said, well, no, we're not a church group. Then the monk just said, well, go away. It's like, oh my gosh. So our turn comes up and I'm the leader or whatever. And he says, are you a church group? And I was like, yes. He's like, okay, come on in. It's like, all right, great. But before he let us in, he looked at me and he looked at this couple that was kind of straggling along behind us. And he says, are they with you? And I was like, yes. And he was like, oh man, I can't believe I lied on the Mount of Temptation. But anyways, the couple got to come in with us. I guess technically they kind of were with us. They walked up with us. He wasn't specific, so, but anyway, so I can relate to the temptation on the mountain. So, but I failed. So you're up on this mountain, and so Satan is there with Jesus. Now, when Jesus was there, he was there alone, in a sense, kind of, right? But the thing is that Jesus really doesn't do anything alone, except maybe this. I mean, think about Jesus' life. When was he alone? There's so few times he was alone. In fact, if anything, he understood the basic fundamental need, not only the natural need, but the supernatural need for us to be a team, for us to strengthen each other, right? Remember when Jesus is in the garden and he's there praying, and Peter, James, and John, what are they doing? They're sleeping. And he's like, come on, guys, come on, pray with me, right? I need you to pray with me. Well, in a few minutes, we're going to be out on Mount Tabor for the Transfiguration, because that was the gospel for this Sunday, another mountain, right? And what is Peter doing? He's becoming drowsy. He's falling asleep. But he doesn't want them to fall asleep. He wants to be a team, right? Okay, so anyways, so he's on the temptation. Well, he's on the Mount of Temptation. So what does Satan do? He tempts him with power and glory. But he says, all these kingdoms I will give to you. I will give you all these kingdoms if you just worship me, right? But Jesus knows that's a lie. He knows it's a lie. At first, when we first hear that temptation, we're like, wow, Satan's got a lot of power. Man, he's intimidating. He's lying. He's lying. He's sneakily trying to convince Jesus that he does have the power so that he can get him to worship him. That's a rather foolish temptation, but very interesting, right? Okay, which is, what I'm going to talk about at the end of my homily is kind of the opposite of one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit that should come from the Holy Spirit residing with us, which is goodness, right? Is goodness. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Okay, but let's journey a little bit. Okay, so you have this one mountain which is out near Jericho, the Mount of Temptation, but let's go on to a couple other mountains. So before we get to the Transfiguration up on the mountain with Moses and Elijah and Jesus and Peter, James and John, and you have this whole team, right? Before we get there, let's go to another mountain. Let's go to Mount Nebo. Mount Nebo, right? That's a cool name. Mount Nebo. So now this is the mountain that Moses was told to go up to look out over the promised land before his people were to cross into the promised land. So remember, they've been journeying in the desert for 40 years, right? And there's a mountain that was central to all of that, Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, it was also called. But they go up to this mountain, Mount Nebo, and they look out over the promised land. And I suppose if it was clear enough, you could actually see across and see Mount Tabor, Transfiguration, right? And then way south would have been the Mount of Temptation. And there's another mountain that we'll get to in a second also. But he's up on Mount Nebo, and God says to Moses, you are not going to enter the promised land. Your people will. You know, remember Joshua takes the people into the promised land, but Moses won't. He's going to die on that mountain, which seems weird. It's like, come on, you know, I mean, he put up with these people for 40 years. You'd think he'd at least be able to walk into the promised land, you know, attain the fruits of his hard work. And so because he doesn't, you almost feel like God has this other plan, or it's almost like he's building to something else, but we're just going to have to wait. It's like a to be continued thing, right? And Moses is going to die on that mountain, but it's like he has to wait for something. So he's waiting to go into the promised land. So many years later, you have Jesus up on this mountain in the promised land that looks out over the promised land up in the area of Galilee. And there's Jesus and Moses. Now, before we get to Moses, there's Elijah. Elijah is like the supreme prophet. He's like one of the best prophets that was sent by God. But there's something very unique about Elijah. He never died. He never actually died. He was taken up into heaven in this fiery chariot, right? And he symbolizes the prophets and all the prophets, okay? And Moses symbolizes all the law. So Moses symbolizes like the institution of the church, right? And Elijah symbolizes the prophets who come to correct the institution once it gets kind of off track, or to keep it on track. But it's also almost like Elijah, it's like there was something not quite finished. Now, the Jewish people know this. If you ever go to a Seder meal, which is a celebration of the Passover, right? Which they do at the same time we do Easter, right about the same time. If you ever go there, they have this symbolic ritual that they do to symbolize Elijah coming back. Because he was going to come back once the Messiah came. Now, who's the Messiah? Well, Jesus. And so you have Elijah who was going to come back. So with him, again, it's like to be continued. So you have Moses and Elijah both have these very odd endings because Jesus wants to bring it all to fulfillment. There on Mount Tabor. So he intentionally brings Peter, James, and John, the new leaders, if you will, the new future leaders of the church, and he brings them up there, and they don't quite get it all yet. They're not ready, right? But still, there it is. Now you see this awesome team. Moses, the fulfillment of the law. Elijah, fulfillment of all the prophets. And Jesus, the fulfillment of both. They're a team. They're an awesome team. Now it's interesting how Jesus words the conversation where he says that he is up there to complete or to bring, what is the word he uses? I always forget it. Who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus that he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Very interesting choice of words where you have Moses right there. Moses is like, oh, so it wasn't just us coming into this promised land. It's not like, hey, let's just go retire to Hawaii. There's this mission that's going to be born from that fruit. And so the gift, the fruit is not just, hey, we get now to relax and not worry about anything, just drink martinis. The fruit is that we get to work. You see, the temptation over on Mount of Temptation, to me, it's almost like Satan was saying to Jesus, don't worry about I'll take care of it all, right? I'll just worship me. I'll do all the work, just worship me. You get to be the king, the leader. You just sit up here. I'll do the work. Worship me, right? But no, the fruit of everything is that we get to work. We get to work for the gospel. We get to be part of a team. That's the climax, if you will, of our faith here on earth. Pretty awesome, right? Now, Peter, who doesn't quite get it right at this moment, he says, hey, Jesus, this is awesome. After he's woken up, he says, let's build some tents here, man. This is great. Now, don't think of, Coleman tents, the little 3-man tents that can only fit like half a person. No, the ones you have to put all the fiberglass poles. It's not one of those tents. It's what they would have built to live in. It was said, let's make 3 homes here. Let's make, this is home. This is awesome. Now, a couple things are going on with Peter. One is he still doesn't quite get the work that needs to be done because he hasn't done any work yet. He's just followed Jesus around, but he hasn't done any work. This is in some ways, this is like a prelude to confirmation for Peter, because when we confirm our kids, when we give them the sacrament of confirmation, it's like, okay, now you're ready to work. You didn't just graduate, you're ready to work now. And Peter hasn't done any work yet. But he's thinking, oh, now we get to just rest and relax. This is awesome. This is like heaven. And Jesus is like, no. My exodus is completed in Jerusalem. Which leads us to another mountain, right? Where does that exodus end? Now, you know the name of the mountain. Calvary, Golgotha. But that whole mountain had another name, Mount Zion. And even before it was called Mount Zion, it had another name, Mount Moriah. And so Mount Moriah was, if you remember from the Old Testament, it was where God told Abraham to go. Now, this is obviously before the city of Jerusalem was built. But he said, go to Mount Moriah and take your son with you. And there he's going to Abraham was going to be told to sacrifice his son. And so he takes his beloved son with him to Mount Moriah. Now, it's a test. He doesn't actually want him to sacrifice his son. He wants to see if he's going to be faithful. But then many years later, there's Jesus, God's beloved son, to bring the exodus to completion. And not to say then, okay, now it's all done, now we can just go to Hawaii. This is so that we can go to work. The fruits of the Holy Spirit are now given, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit are now given and need to bear fruit now in our lives. And so it's no longer about the promised land, it's no longer about land, it's no longer about circumcision, it's about living the fulfillment of the final covenant in Jesus Christ. So I've mentioned gifts of the Holy Spirit. You can look them up. I'm not going to talk about them today. There's 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. But from a gift comes a fruit. So for example, let's say I give you, I don't have anything here. Nothing really worth anything. Let's say I give you my car, right? Here's my keys. I give you my car. Well, let's say you take the keys of my car and you take my car and you go and you park it in your garage and you never use it. You never use it, never take it out, never drive it. Well, did that gift, the gift that I gave you, Did it bear fruit? No. Did I give it to you? Yes. But did it bear fruit? No, you never used it. Okay, sorry, I don't mean you, but I mean figuratively, right? So it was never used. So the gifts of the Holy Spirit are meant to be received and used. It's meant for us to go to work. So everything the Holy Spirit gives us is to go to work. So then we have the fruits of the Holy Spirit is the fruit of our labors, the fruit of the work of using God's grace that He gives us. And so there's 12 of them, right? So then we have faithfulness and love and chastity and kindness and joy and, come on brain, modesty and patience and peace and gentleness and generosity. And then the last is goodness. Goodness, right? What is goodness? Is it just, sometimes people will come in confession and say, well, Father, I'm a good guy. I'm a good guy. In other words, I didn't kill anybody this week. I didn't commit adultery this week. That's good. That's good. But being good is more than just not being bad. If our world needs goodness, it needs people who are willing to work to bring goodness into the world. And I'm not talking about us just doing it on our efforts. It's us bringing God into the world. That's the way we rebuild. That's when there's badness, we replace it with goodness, but we have to work at it. It doesn't just happen by itself. Now Jesus often, like with Peter, James, and John, and 12 disciples, 12 apostles, and all disciples, and He sends the disciples out 2 by 2, He always works as a team, right? Satan tried to get him all by himself because he thought, if I isolate him, then he'll be weak. Well, that's like us. If we don't feel united, we'll be weak. And so we actively try to build teams in our parishes, teams, families. We build love so that we can bring goodness by God's grace. By cooperating with God's grace, we can see the fruit then. And one of those fruits is goodness. And so if we don't see goodness, then we know there's work to be done. Right? We still need to use those gifts of the Holy Spirit in order to bring goodness. There's a term that I used in one of the masses. I called it, we need critical mass. No pun intended, right? Critical mass. Critical mass is if you have 100 people and 99 of them are doing bad things and one is trying to do good. Well, that's like the prophet, right? But the prophet's going to die if it tries to bring goodness. People are just going to gang up on him. And sometimes it happens when it's really bad. God sends a prophet and then they kill him, right? But critical mass is where we tip that scale. We unite ourselves together, and so we form a team so that as we build up that team, then other people are going to feel compelled to open their hearts more readily when they see that team. I think that's why Jesus always sent them out 2 by 2, because they're a team. I can relate to this as a priest, that when it's just me, when it's just my voice, when it's just my message, no, obviously from God, but it doesn't have the same power as if there were 2 or 3 bringing that message. I think that's why also Jesus says, where two or three are gathered, I am in their midst, right? So I say, think about your own life. Do you and your family have other families that you're connected to, that you feel strong with, that you can pray together and you build up your faith and you encourage each other spiritually? Because having that, I think, in some ways makes all the difference in the world. Otherwise, Satan comes to us and picks us apart. Okay, we're not done with our journey, though. We still have another temptation to get to in the desert. And there's one of the other fruits of the Holy Spirit that I'm going to get to probably next week. All right. God bless you. Take care.